Okay, in this video module, what we're going to be doing is talking about basic triggers. Now, triggers can get pretty deep, and we can get all the way into the wonderful world of scripting with triggers. But we're not going to do that here. We're just going to keep things nice and simple so that those that are new to the Doom 3 universe will have no problem getting up to speed with making things interactive in your level. So let's go ahead and start out by talking about what a trigger is. A trigger is the way to have an entity trigger something else, another entity or something else to take place in a scene. An example, in the real world, we have a light in a room, and that light can be triggered by a light switch. We walk into the room, we flip the switch, the light comes on. We flip the switch again, the light goes off. The same thing happens in the whole Doom 3 world. We can set up a trigger, a switch, so that when we walk over, we use this switch, it causes the light to come on or for the light to go back off. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of things we can do. We can trigger secret doors opening up with monsters behind it. We can trigger objects to start moving. We can even go as far as to trigger a particular script to run that can do all sorts of things. So there's quite a bit of flexibility at our fingertips here. Now, for triggers, we have different types, and we're going to be looking at trigger once, trigger multiple, trigger timer, and trigger count in this video. And we've got a couple very simple examples that we're going to set up to give you an idea of how all this works. Logan?
Okay, so the first thing we want to take a look at is how you actually go about creating a trigger. To do this, what the method we'll be using for the ones that can be touched, triggers that you can actually interact with, what we do is we draw out a brush to define the volume of that trigger. Basically, if you touch this area that this brush takes up, you will cause the trigger to fire.
Okay, so hang on one second. Let me add something to this. For those of you that did not watch the last video, you may want to go take a look at that because we're going to pick up from that last video, which was binding entities. If you'll remember, we've got a funk rotating set up over here. And what Logan is starting to set up is the ability for us to trigger this guy so that, let's say we have him started out stopped, where he's not rotating at all. It'd be nice to be able to walk up to him, and then he triggers and starts rotating. So that's kind of the scenario that we're working towards right now. Right. So Logan's using a brush to define a volumetric area that the player can walk into, and that's going to serve as the trigger.
Right. So let me just kind of move that into place. I'm going to lay it flat on the floor and then scale it up to about 64 units tall. Now, where we're going to be going to get to all these trigger entities is right-click, trigger, and then we have our triggers. And all of these that can be interacted with by the player are based on brushes to control their volume. Now, you'll notice that if you have nothing selected and you create one, like if we were to just right here, create a trigger multiple, it seems to work. We click, we have the entity itself, which if we look is a trigger multiple, and we have a brush volume that we can move around and define. Now, this way can be a little sketchy. You might find that sometimes you can't get these to actually respect player collision when set up this way. And it's actually better to start off with just a plain regular brush that you drag out in the viewport. Leave that brush selected, right-click on it, and then create the trigger that way. So if we were to right-click on that brush and hit trigger multiple, what it does is it takes the selected brush and turns that into a trigger multiple and leaves the brush at the same size. So we've already defined the volume, but taking this custom volume and made it into a trigger.
Now this type, trigger multiple, it's not that it's triggering multiple objects, it's kind of like a toggle, on, off, correct?
Right, and the whole point of it is that you can trigger it over and over again. Once it's been used, you can always go back to it later and use it again.
So think of it as trigger multiple times, not multiple objects, because we can use other trigger types to trigger multiple objects as well. Okay?
Right.
So don't confuse that. So this, again, just trigger multiple times.
Okay, so now we've created our trigger by making a brush and then making that brush into a trigger. Now, how do we actually set up the association so that this trigger controls something in the level? It's really pretty simple. If you look under the entity properties, we have on a trigger, you have the target. That's pretty much the simplest property of a trigger, is it has to target something in order for it to be triggered. What happens when you actually hit a trigger is it looks at its target property, or properties as you'll see in a second, and goes to each of those entities that it's targeted at and triggers them. So we want to first trigger this funk rotating. So let me pull up the funk rotating's name real quick, which should just be funk rotating 1. And we want to target funk rotating 1, so we'll simply type target funk rotating 1. And now let me drag it back just a little bit. You see we've got this line drawn between the trigger and what we're targeting, and an arrow face showing which way the connection's going.
As a matter of fact, drag it back a little bit further. Well, actually, let's just line it up straight with it. Yeah, like right there. And let's jump in the game and see what happens right now.
Okay. Now, one thing we have to, or do you want to just?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the BSP real quick.
All right. So let me just save the map out and load up triggers and see what we get. So we've just created a brush, made it into a trigger. Interesting little flow.
Looks like we might have a problem.
Right. I mean, we don't want it to draw because not only is that the wrong shape, it's just a blank black cube.
Right. What we're trying to do is define this invisible volume that a player can walk into and cause something to happen.
Also, it's not even the correct volume.
No, it's not. So there's something that you must do when you create your own brush like this and turn it into a trigger. And that is?
We have to rebuild BSP. Because we've just created a brush, so at this point the engine's just slightly confused as to exactly what it's supposed to do with it. It's like, hey, cool, brush. Let's start drawing it in-game. Wait a second, it's a trigger. It's supposed to do stuff. But a trigger doesn't get handled like a brush, so what we need to do is build BSP, because during build time, it actually takes a look that says, okay, this is a trigger. It's not going to render in-game. Let's make it invisible.
Now let's go ahead and save it out and jump back into game real quick. Now take a look at what happens.
This has properly been accounted for as a trigger and not something that draws. There.
Of course, our model starts out rotating by default, but go ahead and hit the trigger and it should stop it. And now if he just, as a matter of fact, he can go in and out to trigger it on and off, as seen there, or if he just stands still about half a second, it's going to trigger on, off, on.
Which is just the behavior of a trigger multiple.
That's right. So now he can exit out. Let's go ahead and do a few things. Let's, for starters, let's go ahead and cause the rotating model to not start out rotating.
Okay. So it's more like we're actually turning it on. So if we look at the Func Rotating's properties, we'll see that we have a start on value that we can set. And if we set that to 0, well, it's not going to be on when it starts. So now we can load this up and test
take
real
a
quick.
peek. So technically it should start out non-moving, like such, and then you walk up and trigger it. And there it goes.
Or if I, yeah, there we go. Back away fast enough. And
okay, so let's go and jump out of that. Cool. Now that we have that, so we can trigger multiple things as well, correct?
That's right.
So right now we've got a red light over on the left-hand side, and the red light is on by default. Let's see if we can set something interesting up. I want to trigger the red light turning on. So first of all, let's go ahead and, before we do that, we've shown them how to make the association, what we're going to trigger. Let's go ahead and show them an easier way to do it, just using the rotating model, and then we'll show multiples.
Right, because this can really help speed up your workflow. What we've been doing is just setting up target and then actually typing in what we're targeting.
Correct.
There's a much faster way of doing this. Let me actually go in and delete out this target so we see the blue line disappeared. Now, if we select a trigger, we can go to selection and see that we have something called connect entities. This works by taking one object, basically your master object, and then everything else you select after it is what you're connecting it to. So if I was to leave the trigger selected, then shift select the Func Rotating and go up to connect or the shortcut Control K. There, we've got our little target line showing. And if we look back over on the trigger's properties, target has been set up for us.
So let's go ahead and break that real quick, and now let's go ahead and show them that we can do multiples by if we go ahead and select our trigger first, and then we select our rotating and our light. There we go.
Then
now Control K. And look at that. And of course our connection lines are color coded to match the entity color that they're going towards.
Right, and to accomplish this, the actual properties that were set are target and target 1. Basically, you can add pretty much as many targets as you want. Target 1, target 2, target 3, and so on. But that's what's so great about the Control K connection is that it's very easy to do in the viewport. You don't have to worry about names and properties and all yourself.
Exactly. And of course, this is a simultaneous triggering of all of the targets that we have listed over there.
Right.
Okay, so now let's make this a little more interesting. Right now, when you run over it, what's going to happen is the platform will start spinning and the light is going to turn out. So what I want to do is, let's see if we can have some fun with this. Let's go ahead and move our volume area onto the platform. So I want to jump up on it like it's going to be a merry-go-round or something. Okay, that's kind of cool. And so we jump on it, and I want the light to come on. So right now, by default, lights are on. So we need to tell this light that it's going to start out as being off, which is easy because that's just a property we can
I'll select it, and if we dig around in the properties for just a second, we see that we have start off. Now let's say start off 1.
It's
So
1, so
yep,
it's a
start
true.
off with the light turned off.
So now let's go ahead and move that light above the little merry-go-round. So you jump on the merry-go-round and the red light of doom turns on. And it starts spinning.
Alright.
Okay.
So with all that, let's save it out. And load the map back up.
Of course, right now the problem is because of the way the trigger multiple works, about every half a second we'll start, stop. But right now it's off, and the light, it's not rotating, and the light is off. So let's jump on it. Boom, red light is on. And here we go for the little on, off dance. Let's go and jump out of this real quick. And how do we control the speed of this on, off? Back with the trigger.
Well, if we select the trigger multiple, we can go, if we look through its properties, we see we have wait, seconds between triggerings. Or even -1 to make it a one time only. So we could say wait.
So let's, -1 maybe.
So make it only trigger once and then never trigger again. So now if we jump on the merry-go-round.
And here we go. Lots of fun spinning around with our red light on. Now let's go ahead and jump off. Okay, and go ahead and jump back on it. And you'll notice, as Logan just said a second ago, we triggered it one time, and ta-da!
Now it stays on.
Now it stays on forever. And go ahead and jump out of that real quick. And now go ahead and set it to like 3 seconds.
Okay. So 3 seconds between triggerings, as long as we're touching it.
And you'll notice that every 3 seconds it's going to toggle. So as soon as we hit it, there we go, and about there, and then we wait for 3 seconds off, and then there, about 3 seconds on, off. Okay, that's good, Logan. Go ahead and jump out of that. Okay, so that's working with trigger multiple. Now let's take a look at trigger once. Why would we want to use something like trigger once?
Well, it's first off just a much simpler way of having something fire and then never happen again. Never accidentally run over the trigger again. If you stand on it, it still only happens once. It's almost like the trigger itself goes away after you've hit it. It's no longer relevant to the game.
Okay.
So as a quick example, I could delete this trigger multiple I've been using, drag out a new brush to define the area for our trigger once, and do some similar moving and scaling on it. Then right click on it, go down to trigger, and create a trigger once using that brush. So with this trigger once, we'll hold shift, so we have the trigger once still selected, shift, grab the front rotating and the light, control K to target both of them.
Oh, that's so nice.
And then right from here we're pretty much ready to do a BSP, save, and then jump into game.
So now you'll run up right in front of it, trigger it to begin, it'll start rotating, the light will come on, and that's it.
So no matter how long I stay here, if I run away, run back, that's it. One time only trigger. It's useful if you have some part of your level, like after a door is going to lock or some one-time cutscene is going to play. Run through a doorway, you hit the trigger once, it plays, but then if you run back and forth, it doesn't trigger over and over again.
Exactly. Now, we've got trigger timer and trigger count.
This allows us, or gives us more power when working with triggers, and allows us to adjust how the actual triggering functionality happens. Let's see, we can. Which one do we want to set up first? So we'll maybe do just a simple timer.
That sounds good.
Alright, so I'll delete the trigger once out, and this time, because a timer itself isn't you don't physically interact with it. You don't run over it and touch it. So having a brush that we can touch is irrelevant.
Meaning when we spawn into the game, we can just simply turn and look right towards this guy. We don't have to run over to it.
And we don't have to even drag out a brush here. We can
just
say in open space, right click, triggers, trigger, timer. And that's it. We don't have to worry about sizing or anything because really its position and size and everything is irrelevant. So we have the timer set up. Now by default, a timer starts out as off. We actually have to tell it to start on if we want it to be on when the game starts.
Meaning that this trigger could be triggered by somebody else.
Right, and if you a lot of triggers, if you dig around in their properties, you'll notice that triggers can be turned on and off. For example, you could have a trigger multiple that does nothing until some other trigger hits it first.
Exactly.
Then it can be activated.
Allowing us to set up some really complex interactive environments.
That's right. But in this case, we just want a timer that's automatic on its own. So we'll have it start on, and let's save that out and load it up.
So you don't even have to go over there.
Well, we might have to. rebuild BSP because I'm not sure how it has interpreted that so far. We've set start on, but it wasn't actually working yet. So even though it's not really relevant as far as interaction goes, it's still a good idea to do.
What's our time set to as well by default on it?
The time, let's see. Wait. Possibly. Or it might not even have a default value for wait. So let's make the timer maybe a 1 second timer.
Okay, that sounds good.
So grab the right field, add it. So we've got wait and start on. Now it should be automatic. So we load up triggers, and we'll see if it's working. Start waiting, and you see what happened?
Yeah.
Why it's not working?
Mm-hmm.
All this complicated stuff, ensuring that everything's built, it's all clean, all the properties are right. What did we forget to do? No target lines. We haven't targeted at anything. Sure, it's firing once a second. No targets. Nothing actually gets triggered. It's selected, so shift select the func rotating the light, Control K. There we go. Works so much better with things actually targeted. And we look now, and
there it's going. 1
on
second
and off.
on, 1 second off.
Yep. So automatic, we don't have to interact with it. We could if we set up a trigger and turned it off by default. But
Right.
That
Cool.
basically covers the trigger timer.
Okay, now trigger count.
Trigger count almost acts as an intermediate entity between some normal trigger and what you're actually trying to target in the end. What it does is the trigger count itself, every time it is triggered, internally it increments its counter by 1. So if you would set the counter to, say, 3, you would actually have to trigger the counter itself 3 times. Once you reach the 3rd time, the counter would in turn trigger whatever it's targeted at. So let's call up the timer real quick and add one into the level. Right click, add trigger, count. And again, the count itself is never touched or anything, so its actual size is irrelevant. And to go along with that now, let's add a trigger multiple. So do kind of the standard drag out of volume, make it about that high. Trigger multiple. And for the trigger multiple setup, let me go over and set first a weight of about 1, that's fine. We'll also set it so that, let's see, a weight of 1 should be enough for that guy.
That should be okay.
For the count, we're going to give it a count of 3. So we have to hit it 3 times before it in turn triggers something. Now, in order to show how this is actually working, what I'll do is I'll use the light as a display for my trigger multiple, and the func rotating what the counter actually controls. So I'll select the trigger multiple, shift select the light, hit Control K. So as we're standing on that, we'll get to see the light blinking
So the
on and
light,
off.
so it starts out off. So when you go into the trigger, the light comes on. That'll be a count of 1 is what will end up with the trigger count. And then as the light goes off, there'll be a count of 2. And as the light comes back on, there'll be a count of 3. And then the trigger count should send out a trigger to start the rotating of the model.
That's right. So we've got our indicator for what the count is set up. Now we also need to make sure that we target the counter itself, so we start incrementing. Let me move this over to the side so we can see all the event lines. And then the trigger count itself to the func rotating.
Cool.
So trigger to count to rotating, and then trigger directly to light. So let me grab BSP so we have that area for the trigger properly defined, and test it out. So we go over to the trigger multiple.
1, 2, 3.
And it starts.
1, 2, 3.
Well, see, at this point, now notice this. The light continues to flash on and off because it's directly connected to the trigger multiple.
Exactly.
The counter doesn't appear to restart because no matter, even though we've hit 3 many times now, the func rotating continues to rotate.
But, what if you wanted to go 3 more and turn off?
That would be a simple property on the counter itself.
Exactly.
We can go down to repeat, and if we set that to 1, it's repeatable. The moment we hit 3, it starts over and starts counting again.
All right, let's give it a shot. So again, 1, 2, spin. 1, 2, stop. There you go. Beautiful.
So there we've set up a scenario where we have a counter controlling whether or not something actually gets triggered.
Okay. And again, this, as I said at the beginning of this lesson, this is just basic triggers. I mean, we can take this and really start getting into some deep, crazy stuff. But we had to start somewhere, and this kind of lays the foundation for an understanding of how triggers work, how to set them up, how to do a couple cool things with them. Logan's, anything else you want to add?
Nope, that's pretty much what you need to know for getting some basic trigger setups working.
Okay, so with that, that's going to wrap up this lesson.